Hello everyone and welcome to this episode, the bias one, of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I'm Andrew Jacobs. It's unusual, but we've a few episodes coming up which seem to run together. Following this episode, we'll have ethics, and prejudice is coming up soon as well. This was a recent addition to the list, and we weren't sure we'd find guests for it immediately. How wrong we were. Our first guest is Mariana Horrisberger. Mariana is an English, Spanish and Portuguese translator with over 10 years of experience in the e-learning localisation field. Born and raised in Argentina, she's travelled and moved around plenty in her career, and over the last 5 years she specialised in high-profile learning programmes in the corporate training and higher education realms. She believes firmly in uplifting others, so she strives to give back and be a force for good in the L&D community. Part of that means co-leading the global learning and development community, a networking space for people in learning and development. Our next guest is Yasmin Alani. Yasmin is a multi-award winning professional, recognised for being a top 100 future leader, culture pioneer of learning, and the LPI's Learning Professional of the Year. She has a wealth of experience driving transformational change programs across global organisations, and these include the Times, DLG, the Ministry of Justice, HSBC, Rolls-Royce, ASOS and TalkSport. Yasmin has a passion for putting people at the centre of transformation and has achieved meaningful change in the culture space, from working with our legal system to tackle unconscious bias in domestic abuse cases in courtrooms, to designing bespoke leadership sessions to challenge C-suite executives to commit to true allyship. Recorded in September this year, this is Women Talking About Learning. This is Mariana and Yasmin talking about bias.
Hi Mariana, how are you doing today?
Hi, Yasmin. I'm really good. How are you?
I'm really well. I'm so excited to be on this chat with you. I think a really important thing for us to start talking about is why did you decide you wanted to talk about the topic of bias?
Oof, that's a really loaded question early on. Well, I think bias. I think everybody experiences. Has an experience with bias at any given point in their lives, right? And especially, I feel being women, we're always, a bit more prone to being subjected to bias and, preconceived ideas as to who we are, what we do, how we're supposed to be, right? Depending on where we're from or what we're doing or their age. So, I feel like there's so much to talk about in this topic. What about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree with all of that. I think there's something for me about the older you get and the more you kind of look back on your life, maybe you didn't recognize that kind of at the time, but then you realize actually how much bias has kind of followed you around. And, we kind of talked about it just before this, like we're both women, we're both ethnic minority women. And I think when I look back at my really early career, I'd started actually my career in law, just very kind of archaic, very biased actually. And as like a young ethnic minority female, didn't probably realize at the time, like how many barriers were in my way just because there were certain expectations. And then, or, the way that women are perceived in the legal kind of community. And then, just like even, beyond that, and then I kind of left law and, went into work into corporate. And again, like didn't kind of think about it at the time, but when I was getting feedback on my performance, actually a lot of the conversation was around what I was wearing rather than my performance. And I remember at the time, my senior manager, who was a man, was really angry about that, and I never understood why. And I recognize now that actually he recognized that would not have happened if it was a man. It was just because he was a senior manager of a certain age and I was a young woman in my early 20s, and there are things that you kind of look back on, you think, that's bias at play there. And, it doesn't go away. And the more you understand about it, the more you see it.
Yeah.
And that's actually like the worst bit The more you see it, the more you see even more of it. And it becomes frustrating to explain to people who don't see it because it's so obvious, right? It's like everywhere.
I know, it's like you're being gaslighted. No, but seriously, didn't you? Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that. I feel like my experience has been kind of on an opposite journey. And I think in terms of do I see it more? Do I notice it more? I feel like the fact that I come from, I'm from Argentina. I lived in Brazil. So, I've had a very South American experience before moving to the US 5 years ago. And the fact that things are slightly better for women here makes me be a bit more relaxed about it. So I tend to let go of certain things that maybe in the past I would be a lot more triggered by.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because I also, whenever something really bluntly biased or misogynistic happens, I get so triggered. But if it's the little things, I'm like, well, it's because they're from this background, or it's because, it's also my self-applying my bias towards certain people and why they see women a certain way, why they, behave a certain way towards women. But yeah, I think the fact that I, growing up, and especially in my early 20s, I experienced so much sexism, so much misogyny, because, in South America, things are not as good as in North America, right? There's, things have been changing. Things are very different from when I was a kid, but there's still a lot of preconceived ideas as to, whether women are good drivers, whether women are good for certain roles, if women are good for leadership, or if they're just bossy and annoying. And, just being in a space where I don't see that often makes me kind of, stop worrying about it as much, which then kind of startles me when I have, I've attended conferences of women in learning and development, and I hear all these things. I'm like, yeah, no, that's happened to me too. Yeah, that actually happened to me from a female boss. That's outrageous. But because I'm not actively looking for it, it's like I'm just letting it go, because it's also exhausting to be policing people constantly, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like, the exhaustion is real. Like, you've already hit on so many things that I want to explore. I'm curious to know, do you think that because your comparative level of what you understand of how things can be actually makes you a bit more blinded to maybe some of the more, I'm going to call them like discrete biases that happen, because your natural anchoring bias is, oh, well, I know like how bad it could really get, or, whatever. And so those kind of, because there's no way that we can say that stuff is not happening in the US. Like, I'm based in the UK, and stuff is definitely happening here, but it's almost on this really like not an overt level. And I think you picked up on another thing that I really want to get into about women and how we almost, and I'm sorry to any guys listening because this isn't coming for you, but like, we make excuses for that behavior to protect male egos. And that is something you are conditioned by as a woman, to excuse behaviors that are masculine. And obviously that comes from women in relationships initially, but I think it carries over for sure into the workplace.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And yeah, like you said, I feel like when you compare it to things that were much worse, you're like, well, this is not as bad, so I don't want to be calling it out constantly. I don't want to be complaining about this constantly, because that's also a really big bias, right? Women are, always complaining about things. Women are difficult, right? When you're the one raising problems at work, you're difficult. Why don't you just go with it like the rest of the team, right? It's you that is the problem. It's not the fact that there's a problem in the men in leadership, because in most cases, still today, leadership is composed primarily by male employees. They don't want to see certain issues, or they don't see it as an issue because it doesn't affect them, right?
Yeah.
Because they are male. So,
exactly.
And I think there's also at least in my case, I don't want to go super deep into intersectionality, but there's also different things that affect us. Andrew mentioned imposter syndrome early on, and but before we started recording, and there's imposter syndrome tends to affect women a lot more than men, and I think it is in part this idea of having to justify yourself every single time you make a decision, you make a suggestion, you want to propose something at work, or you do something. It's always you need to work so much harder than a man to get to the same places.
And that is the thing, and that is a really important thing for us to pull out, because I think when people talk about imposter syndrome, like in the round, it's framed as, oh, it happens to women more because women have less confidence. But it isn't that. It's because the expectation of women is so much higher. The scrutiny is so much higher. Like, I see stuff that male leaders get away with that just never, like, you would be immediately like step down from a position if you're a woman, not because they're, behaving in terrible kind of overt ways, but because the standard you have to be as a female leader is so much higher. And you're always walking that tightrope as well between being too bossy, frosty, but actually, and then if you're too gentle on the other side, you are seen as weak, you're seen as, so there actually is the exhaustion that it takes for women to be perfectly in the middle of those two things, I think leads women to burnout so much quicker. And then that is even before you talk about the mental load that they're carrying at home, if they're a mother and they have young children or kind of any children. Like, it's an impossible standard, and it's something that I think for me personally, what I have noticed looking back on my kind of career, I've noticed that what I've done to succeed is actually to adopt really masculine behaviors, because that will allow people to kind of take me seriously, and that means I'm a credible businesswoman, and that comes at the cost probably of being seen as a gentle person perhaps, or I don't know. I think there's a lot of your identity that you have to eradicate when you're getting to kind of senior levels, because also tall poppy syndrome like really, really exists. And I am always second guessing myself about, well, actually, I don't want to shout too loudly about my achievements. I'm a really ambitious person, but if I shout too loudly, then like people are gonna, start to it's like when the media, it's like when the media really build up a celebrity and then they start like cutting them down. Like, that's kind of how it feels. And I wonder whether men have that conscious daily thought, or they're just going about their lives, not worrying about necessarily. They might worry about the ramifications of a commercial decision they make, but they're probably not worrying about, oh, is this going to make people like me less or not? Because that inbuilt respect for men as leaders is already there, unquestioned.
Yeah, no, you touched on so many different things. I can totally relate to identifying some more masculine traits in myself that I have built to especially, I've been in sales for many years now, and when you're out there and you need to do business with men, and there's of course not all men, right, but there's a certain type of businessman especially in the, executive level, that have this arrogance with them, and they're always, belittling you or undermining your expertise in your field, or your capability of walking in, negotiating those big deals with those big executives. And I too have identified those traits in myself. And it's hard to tell. It's I keep thinking of the book Lean In by Sandberg. And it kind of talks about that as well, right? The fact that, women have to be, stronger and just, go out there and do those things. And I don't know that that's necessarily the way, the ideal scenario for women, right? It should be, you shouldn't have to change your personality or change the way you behave to be respected at work.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And it kind of leads to another thought that I have a lot of the time around the working world is designed for men to succeed, because originally that is how it was created, right? And it's not really that far different or adapted since the 1950s or, whatever. So it is not about what we're trying to do, I think, at the moment, is fit women into masculine structures. So the people who are, and it's very then easy to point at women who are successful and go, well, look, she's a woman, she's successful. And right, but if you dismantle why she is successful, it's because she's been able to mold herself into a male structure. But that doesn't provide equity to women. And what happens if we completely flip, if we completely destroy it all and we say, right, we're building a workplace that is women first? I wonder how difficult it would be the other way. And I'm not just talking about things like flexible working. I'm talking about things like pay, kind of transparency. And we're told a lot that women aren't as good as at negotiating, but that goes so deep into how women are taught to deal with money. There was some research that I read a couple of years ago, because we were doing some work with a financial institution, and the investment gap between men and women is like in the billions, probably trillions. I don't know. It's an insane amount of money, because what our women are historically told is your money is to look after the children. Your money is to pay for the food. Your money is not. You're dissuaded from taking risk with that money because you have to have it in the safety of the nest, And I think that narrative continues into the workplace as well. So we're never kind of really taught about money, or we're not in the conversations about money. It's still a very boys club kind of thing. I've really tried to take it upon myself to learn about investing and that kind of stuff. But even intrinsically, it feels gambly, because that is obviously instilled into me of, I don't know, you just have to have that, it's not your place to play, to go and invest that money. And I found it, I almost went and sought out those investments, because I was like, I am not you have to break the barrier. But actually that's me putting it upon myself to try and push through that, those systemic things, rather than society being no, we're seeing this imbalance in gender and we need to rebalance it, so women that can mold themselves into male structures do really well, but that's not equality. And people will be very quick to go, well, we've got a 50-50 gender split. Great, but is it 50-50 because every woman has had the opportunity, or is it just the women who've been able to mold themselves that have been able to succeed?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that you mentioned something about, kind of pushing through the struggles of, all of these ideas of, oh, women shouldn't be, concerned about finances in terms of investment and, building equity. And it feels like you're always second guessing yourself, because when you do step into these worlds that are not supposed to be for women, or that haven't been traditionally built for women, you do feel like an outsider in a way, and you do start second guessing yourself and kind of thinking like, well, maybe I don't know, maybe I shouldn't learn about finance. Like, I don't know, maybe should I really be worrying about investing? Or it's and yeah, it is very difficult to really break into those spaces, as you said. And while you were talking, I was thinking about even this notion of men tend to apply to jobs. They're I think 70% more likely to apply to jobs without having all the qualifications for jobs, and women don't tend to do that. And I've been seeing that a lot in ads as well, in job postings, and I keep thinking, let's say women do apply to those jobs without having the qualifications. Will they get hired to those jobs without having all the qualifications in the same rate as men? Or will they still be judged in terms of, I see a lot of, especially ageism for women in the workplace, and it goes both ways. If you're young, then what if you get pregnant and then you'll be gone for a couple of months? Even in the US, where maternity leave is not really a thing, unless your employer provides maybe 2 months, 3 months of maternity leave, which is crazy to me, coming from, South American country that doesn't have all the means, but has really good protections for women in those spaces, which is great and should be the case everywhere. But I also see women in, maybe in their 50s or 60s, and they're being told they're too old or they're overqualified.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking, do men in their 50s struggle to find jobs? Are they told they're too old or overqualified, or their careers are over because they're 50? I don't. And again, this is mostly anecdotal, but I was thinking about that today, because it's not only the what can we do with our money once we have it. It's also, I feel like it's even harder for women to build equity, to have to earn money, right? You mentioned the pay gap, which is still an issue everywhere in the world. It's getting better, but it's still an issue.
Well, it's funny because I think the other week was Equal Pay Day, or it was a kind of inclusive holiday that was about basically looking at equal pay. So I did a little research into it, and a little kind of segment at work. And actually the pay gap is about 14.3%, which isn't great. But actually what is worse is, as a woman goes through her career, because there isn't equity in the workplace for all the things that you've talked about. So we still don't really have a culture of shared parental leave. Most places, paternity leave is like 1 or 2 weeks. So the inference already is it is the woman's job to raise the child, not just grow the child, but to raise the child. Like, that is supported, or that's the narrative by law. And that gap just continues to widen then, like, as women try and return into the workplace. And I'm sure this has been discussed on so many of these podcasts, but ultimately by the time we get to pension, the pension gap is about 40.5%, which is mad. So what starts as still a gap that needs to be addressed, it's actually the compound impact of that results. And then we're going into all of these things like investment and whatever. But just to pick up on the other point that you were talking about, because I was literally talking to my partner about this the other week, and something, when I look at a male trajectory in the workplace from, say, the age of 20 to retirement, I see a straight line kind of going up. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But and it's difficult in this podcast because people are just going to hear our voices. But, you know, if you think of that graph, like starting bottom low and then going up to the top, it's almost like a straight shoot trajectory. Whereas for women, it's almost like this bell curve, you know what I mean? So you've got this sweet spot maybe in the middle where you're not too young, so you're not being taken seriously. You know, when I was a young lawyer, no one was taking me seriously, you know what I mean? And I was working kind of family and divorce, or no one was listening to me. And then you maybe have this kind of middle bit, but that's also the time when women are building up their career, but they also, because of the fertility element, need to go and have children if that's what they want to do. Then the time it takes for them to kind of get confidence back in the workplace. Workplaces are not set up for some businesses. Absolutely are getting better at this. But that movement is being driven by women. It's not being driven by the male leaders to say, hey, what if we had more equity in the workplace? Then we would, whereas financially and commercially, it's the smart thing to do because you are getting people up, like, you know, back on their skill set much more quickly. That's what irritates me if it's not coming across. It makes it's not just the right thing to do. It makes financial sense, commercial sense. It affects the bottom line. Like, it supports everybody to have equity around women returning to work. But yet the work has to be pushed by the group it's being most, like, it's affecting the most. So yeah, and then I mean, probably a whole other episode to talk about beauty bias and things like that, where you are taken more seriously if you are attractive, but not too attractive, because then you cross the line into you're just a kind of bimbo sexual object. Of course, you're only senior because you're, you know, XYZ with certain partners. So you always have to, you're either shrinking yourself down or trying to peacock yourself, but not too much, because that's when people are going to start talking about you.
I know. Yeah. Finding that middle ground, that sweet spot is practically impossible for most women. But yeah, I think the, you know, with all the issues with fertility rates dropping all over the world, you know, all governments starting to look at this issue, thinking, what are we going to do with pensions, right? In the decades to come. You'd think that more governments would try to come up with policies to help women, you know, have that, like you said, have that security of, I can take a couple months to go bond with my child, be with my child, breastfeed, whatever it is they need to do, and then come back knowing they'll still have a job and they'll still have a career without having to take a massive, you know, break in their career development, taking a pay cut, taking, you know, all these things that I don't see men experience that. And I have dear friends that are great fathers, and they are as involved in childbearing as their partners, and they get promotions when they tell their bosses that they're gonna start a family. And I don't see that in on the women's side. And as you said, the few cases that I've seen, again, anecdotally, have been companies where the CEO is a woman and has children herself. So she understands that the struggle of, oh my God, am I going to basically drop my career if I want to have children? Like it becomes an either or option for many women, and it shouldn't be that case, because it's also, you know, it's the productivity. It's not just for the women themselves and their own development. It's, you know, if you think about it in a numbers perspective, it's the GDP that the country loses from all these people in productive years being away from the workforce because they're discriminated against for being mothers, or they're not accommodated for being mothers, or for wanting to start a family. And it's crazy. It's crazy that it's an issue that we're still talking about, but it feels like nothing is really changing, other than, like you said, some companies are trying to accommodate, and, you know, in some cases it's more lip service than others, and some companies are really, really accommodating for their their employees in that regard.
Yeah, I feel like the almost the temperature at the moment, and maybe this is, just typical of all businesses, or maybe all humans, we're very good at seeing like what's directly in front of us, but maybe not like the longevity in the future. Because what I feel like we are having the same conversation that was probably happening, like 20 years ago, in the 90s, in the 80s. And yes, there have been shifts, but not like that there should have been in like 30 years. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I really struggle to understand why, because there isn't, as far as I'm aware, research that will point to, this being a really bad idea. Do you know what I mean? If you provide more equity, then actually that's going to be really detrimental. If you provide more flexible working, that's going to be like really detrimental. Like everything that is done in the pursuit of equity is shown heads and shoulders above to help every element of a business. So that's one aspect. But I suppose the question could be, how do we move it forward? What do we need to see more of? I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
I think it would be great. I mean, if I was a business owner, I feel like I would try to help my employees. I think we're kind of at a crossroads in terms of the job market, in that, company loyalty is not a thing anymore. And it's not just from the employees to the companies, but also companies just massively laying people off because of business changes or directions. But I feel like there's still, we always talk about this in L&D. It's so much more cost effective to retain your employees and training them than losing them and having to spend money and time rehiring, retraining, people that you don't even know if they're going to be good employees at that, because you're, every time you hire someone, you're gambling. And I feel like we could do more from the corporate world, especially people in leadership positions, to really try to really live their words. And a lot of businesses are saying, we're a family, we're this company is like a family, we're all like a family. Okay, if you were hiring your daughter-in-law, you would give her maternal leave, and you would give your son maternal leave, right? You would try to accommodate for them to be able to start a family without risking losing their career. You would do other things if you were truly a family. And I know it's not true that businesses are a family, but it is something that is thrown around lightly. Right. But I do believe that it really has to come from people in decision-making positions. It's really hard to tell women, go advocate for yourself. When you're negotiating that next contract, go ask about maternity leave, or go ask about fertility options, right? A lot of companies are offering that now. But I every time I see that, I go like, but is that really true? Like, what happens if an employee wants to, undergo, goes and tells their boss, I want to undergo a fertility treatment while I'm employed at this company? Like, will that affect their productivity? Will that affect their capability to retain their job? Yeah. Or will they find another excuse to let them go in the future, just because now they want to start a family and they're gonna be unreliable? Yeah. Right. And it's that's everything really what you've said, because what I get frustrated about, and we're not even talking about just women here, we're talking about any minoritized group. I think if we're opening up to the wider DEI conversation, what we see is those groups have to advocate for themselves rather than leaders. And I suppose, if there are leaders in the audience listening, like, I cannot stress to you enough how much influence and power that you hold, not just because, okay, you've got that title, but there's research that backs
that people start to mimic how leaders walk and talk. Do you know what I mean? Because it's so influential. So whenever I'm leading any piece on change, like my first question is, how bought into this are your leaders? Because if the answer is, yeah, they're kind of on board with it, but they're not going to do anything about it, it's going to fail. And you know, going back to your example of that singular woman that's advocating for herself, like, yeah, maybe she's going to get what she needs from that one conversation, but that doesn't help the narrative move forward. There's just been maybe an exception made for that one person. So I went to a conference a couple of months ago, and actually there was a male speaker from Finland there, who was talking about the paternity policies that were just given, you know, in Finland, and particularly then we can look to the Scandi countries for being more progressive kind of in that space, but really having those legal pieces of leave where it's almost expected that a man is going to take the time off. And, you know, not even withstanding the conversation about how important it is for that both parents to bond with their child, you know, whatever your familial structure is, but just HR and leaders looking at their policies and not just thinking, well, what can we get away with? What is the legal, you know, cap? But what is actually the progressive and equitable thing to do? And we can go into things like pay structures, making sure that there's pay transparency on all sides coming into the organization. You have a really set timetable of when pay is reviewed and appraised, and people are given salary raises in the same way, in a fair way. It's not just the boys' club of who's in with the CEO or who's, you know, can kind of shout the loudest or whatever, because you're immediately creating that inequality of pay. Because what happens is men are probably starting at a higher rate for the same role, because if your pay is in a band and then there's that kind of negotiation up front, they're starting higher and then they're kind of just climbing higher and higher, because then they're kind of having those conversations. So, you know, there's so many things that I don't actually think are that complicated to move the conversation on in the equitable space. And I think, don't quote me, I'm not sure if this is so right, but I believe in the EU, it is becoming law to put salaries on job descriptions, and there's a lot more directed kind of in that space. Obviously, in Britain, we are no longer part of the EU, so whether the government will follow suit because that is the right thing to do or not, I'm not sure. But that should be a thing. I know that they are publishing, if your employees are over a certain amount, then you have to publish your gender pay gap, but you don't actually have to publish your ethnicity pay gap yet. So it's things like that I can't believe it's 2024 and we're still not. These are basic things, you know.
I know. And going back to the paternal leave, because now that you mentioned it, I keep going back. I can't remember the article. I think it was an Economist article that mentioned that even in cases where paternity leave was offered, men still don't take it, or don't take the full extent of their allowance for paternity leave. And the reasoning they gave is that they were afraid of their careers being impacted or not getting a promotion, because if they wanted to take time to bond with their child, then that means they don't really care about the job enough, right? And I feel this also goes back to that idea you mentioned earlier of women being expected to have the full burden and responsibility of raising a child, keeping a household, you know, all those things that women are just expected to do, and it's kind of like an afterthought at this point. And you know, that affects men too, because they also should have time to bond and and to get used to the huge life change of having a baby in the house. And you know, the fact that it's still solely a female responsibility makes it so that they're also affected by this. So I think paternity leaves are great as well, but we should, I don't know if making them mandatory, but we should really enforce or encourage men to take the full extent of the paternity leave, because then if both men and women are going to be gone for a given period of time when they start a family, then there shouldn't be any difference, right? There shouldn't be any difference between hiring a woman, hiring a man, because they'll both be gone when they start a family.
Isn't it funny? And I know we could talk about this forever and ever, and we'll probably have to wrap up soon, but I think it's really funny that the reason that is the reason that men have said that they don't want to, because that is exactly what happens to women. Like, the reason that they don't want to take paternity leave is for all of the things that women have to suffer through. And it really reminds me of when the pill came out, when the female pill came out. They actually have created a male pill. They know how to do it. But the reason it was never launched to the market was they reported mood swings, depression, suicidal thoughts, all the things that women have to go through. That is exactly the same, because it's doing the same thing. But that is the reason they didn't launch the male pill to the market. And I just think, there you go. That is the inbuilt bias. And that probably summarizes quite nicely what we're talking about. But I suppose our final point to end on is thinking about what do we want to close? What's our call to action, probably for both men and women in the audience?
Well, I think there's something I wanted to say, especially when talking about how do we move forward, how do we change this status quo, and I think something that I see often, both with DEI, representation, and feminism in general, is some people that are not the primary. I don't want to say victims, but the people that are primarily affected by these issues are the ones making the changes and taking the decisions. I feel like it's really important to have the people involved, the people directly affected by this, be involved in those conversations. So the whole thing of like, oh, this is what I think from my, white male cisgender perspective. This is what I think we should do to help this particular minority, this particular community. That doesn't work. We really need to give people the voice to actually, tell it how it is. Really explain, what is it about this status quo that is affecting women? What is it about this status quo that is affecting minorities more specifically than maybe, white women or white men? And, we all have our biases. That's just a fact. We all have preconceived ideas about multiple things. Some we agree with, some we just were raised to believe those things, and we were, socialized into a specific state of the world that we just never really questioned, or we haven't questioned the full extent of it. And I think the more we engage with people in other situations, from other backgrounds, in other, with other perspectives, I think that's where we can fully get a broader understanding of what the issue is, and we can find actionable solutions to finally change these things. But I can't stress this enough. You need to have the people that are experiencing this be involved in the solution. We can't be dictated by 3 white dudes that have never even had children. Or experienced any of this.
Completely echo everything you've said. And what I'd probably just add to that is, if you are in the majority group, bring people into that space as well. Like, when we talk about allyship, I think we throw it around like quite flippantly. And what I've noticed a lot of men doing, and men, I love you, but almost I hear the not all men all the time. And I'm like, okay, but what are you doing actively to help change that narrative? You know what I mean? Like, just because you're not actively doing that most terrible thing, that doesn't make you an ally. That makes you just like a bystander. You know what I mean? We need active allyship. And I think, you know, some beautiful examples of that are, you know, we've all seen Andy Murray, no matter what you think about him as a tennis player, but, you know, the minute an interviewer will ask him a question that is so heavily male biased, he will bring, you know, female tennis players into the conversation. As a matter of fact, not like because he's trying to be a savior. He's like, I think you've forgotten about X, Y, Z. So, you know, it's hard for us to try and see things that we don't normally see. Do you know what I mean? That we're not plugged into. But I think we all have a collective responsibility. We're all privileged in some way, you know what I mean? In some way. And using that to bring up the groups, like you said, into, you know, bring who's missing from the table, who's not got a voice at the table, bring that person along, because the power is still held in pockets of majority groups. And if we're talking about true allyship, we're talking about those majority groups bringing the minority voices to the table with the power that they hold.
Absolutely. Use your privilege for good.
Absolutely.
Share some of that with.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Mariana. It's been just a joy to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Likewise. Yeah, this was fantastic. I feel like we could talk for hours on end, but
there might be a part 2. Who knows?
There you go. Yeah, I'd love that.
Thanks so much.
Have a great day.
You too.
As you might know, some episodes really do hit home for us here, and this is one of them. A huge thank you to our great guests for giving up their time and sharing their thoughts and experiences in making such a great episode. You can find links to all the references mentioned in the podcast within the show notes, along with Mariana and Yasmin's profiles and contact details. We can't quite believe we're approaching the 100th episode of the podcast, and we want to hear from you, our listeners. With this in mind, we've decided to open up our recording studio on Friday the 1st of November between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. for anyone, and that includes our male listeners, to record a very short piece telling us what they think about the podcast. For example, what have been your favourite episodes and what has stood out to you? Don't worry if you're not available on that date. You can still contribute by sending us a short, no more than 3 minutes, audio or video, and that needs to come to hello@larn.com. If you don't want to send audio, just your written comments will be fine. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and next time it's the ethics one. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.